The jagged rocks of the crimson waste tore at Lyra's worn boots, each step a prayer against the unforgiving terrain. Dust, the color of dried blood, caked her face and clung to her ragged tunic. For 3 sun cycles, she had run, fueled by a primal fear that gnawed at her insides, a fear with a name, the Hunter. Whispers in the shattered settlement spoke of them in hushed, terrified tones, relentless, silent figures dispatched by the unseen council to retrieve or eliminate those who strayed from the ordained path. Lyra had done more than stray, she had defied. She carried a secret, a small, intricately carved data locket, warm against her skin, that the council would kill to reclaim and then kill her for possessing. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak, threatening to drag her down. Her canteen was empty, her body screamed for rest, but the image of the Hunter, a figure she'd only heard described in chilling detail, spurred her onward. They were said to be creatures of shadow and steel, their faces hidden behind impassive masks, their movements too swift for the eye to follow. Death was their trade, and they were masters of it. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The desolate landscape stretched back, empty and stark under the oppressive amber sky of Xylos. But the absence of pursuit was no comfort. Hunters did not chase, they anticipated. They were the period at the end of a life sentence. A loose shale skittered underfoot, and Lyra cried out as her ankle twisted. She collapsed, a wave of despair washing over her. The pain was sharp, nauseating. This was it. She couldn't go on. Tears of frustration and terror welled, tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. The locket felt like a lead weight now, a pointless burden. She had failed. The silence of the waste pressed in, amplifying the rasp of her own breathing. Then, a subtle shift in the air, a displacement of shadow among the rocks above her. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. He was here. Slowly, with a dreadful certainty, she turned her head. He stood on the ridge, silhouetted against the sickly sky, a figure as lean and sharp as a shard of obsidian. The descriptions hadn't done him justice. He was taller than she'd imagined, clad in dark, articulated armor that seemed to absorb the meager light. No mask, but his face was shadowed by a hood, features obscured, making him all the more menacing. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply was. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the searing pain of a particle beam, the cold touch of a blade. This was the end she had run from, the end she had always known was inevitable. She thought of her younger brother, Tal, safe in the hidden enclaves, she hoped. This locket was for him, for the future he might have if the council's iron grip could ever be loosened. The thought was a small, defiant spark in the overwhelming darkness of her fear. She clutched the locket, its familiar contours a tiny comfort. A soft crunch of gravel. He was moving, descending the ridge with an unnerving, fluid grace. Each footfall was precise, silent. Lyra forced her eyes open. She would not die cowering. She would look her executioner in the eye, if he even had eyes she could see. He stopped a few feet away, his presence an almost physical force. The air around him seemed colder. Lyra could smell the faint, metallic tang of his armor, the scent of distant, sterile places. She stared at the shadowed space beneath his hood, searching for any hint of humanity, any flicker of emotion. There was nothing. Just the promise of oblivion. "Get it over with," she whispered, her voice hoarse, surprising herself with its steadiness. She expected a swift, brutal end. A weapon drawn, a final, impersonal act. The Hunter remained still for a long moment, the silence stretching taut. Then, he moved. Not to strike, but to kneel. The Hunter knelt, the articulated plates of his armor sighing softly. The movement was economical, precise, devoid of any wasted energy. Lyra watched, bewildered, her mind struggling to reconcile this action with the terrifying image she held. He reached out a gloved hand, not towards her throat or the locket, but towards her injured ankle. His touch was unexpectedly gentle as his fingers probed the swelling. Lyra flinched, a gasp escaping her lips, half pain, half surprise. He paused, then his head tilted slightly, an almost inquisitive gesture. From a pouch at his belt, he produced a small, metallic cylinder. With a twist, it unfurled into a strip of pliant, self-adhering medical wrap. He began to bind her ankle, his movements efficient and practiced. The wrap felt cool against her skin, and the throbbing pain began to recede almost immediately, replaced by a firm, supportive pressure. Lyra stared, speechless. This was not the act of an executioner. This was care. Why, she finally managed, the word a dry croak. The hunter finished securing the wrap and rose to his feet, once again towering over her. He still hadn't spoken. The silence was unnerving, but the immediate threat of death had lessened, replaced by a profound confusion. He then unclipped a canteen from his belt, sleeker, larger than her own depleted one, and offered it to her. Lyra hesitated. Was this a trick? Some cruel prelude to a more elaborate torment? But her thirst was a raging fire in her throat. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. The metal was cool. She drank, the water cleaner, purer than any she'd tasted in weeks. It was like a balm to her parched system. He watched her, his posture unwavering, his face still lost in shadow. When she finished and handed it back, her gaze locked onto where his eyes should be. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a little stronger now. "What do you want?" He made no reply. Instead, he turned and surveyed the surrounding terrain, his head moving slowly, methodically. He seemed to be assessing, calculating. Then, he gestured with a subtle inclination of his head towards a narrow, shadowed defile in the rocks to the north. It was a path she hadn't noticed, almost hidden from view. The implied instruction was clear: follow. Lyra's mind raced. Was he leading her into a trap? Or to a more convenient location for her execution? Yet, he'd had every opportunity to kill her already. He'd tended her injury, given her water. It made no sense. The alternative, however, was to remain here, injured and alone, to die of exposure or be found by whatever else lurked in the Crimson Waste, or perhaps by another, less ambiguous hunter. The locket pressed against her chest, a reminder of her purpose. She had to survive. She had to get it to someone who could understand its contents, someone who could use it. With a grunt of effort, she pushed herself up, testing her bandaged ankle. It held, the support surprisingly strong. The hunter waited patiently, his stillness a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. She took a tentative step, then another. He began to walk, not waiting for her to catch up but setting a pace that was challenging yet manageable for her injured state. The defile was cool and narrow, the rocks rising high on either side, casting long, dancing shadows. It offered concealment, but also the potential for ambush. Lyra stayed a few paces behind him, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, every sense on high alert. The hunter moved with an eerie silence, his armored feet finding purchase on the uneven ground without dislodging a single pebble. He was a part of the landscape, blending into the shadows and stone. Hours passed in this strange, silent procession. The amber sky began to darken, the temperature dropping sharply as the twin suns of Xylos dipped below the jagged horizon. Lyra shivered, the thin material of her tunic offering little protection against the biting wind that now whistled through the canyons. The hunter seemed unaffected by the cold. He paused, and Lyra nearly collided with his unyielding back. He had stopped before a shallow cave, little more than an overhang in the rock face. He gestured towards it. Sanctuary, or another test. He didn't enter the cave himself but began to gather dried scrub brush from the base of the cliff. Lyra watched, suspicion warring with a desperate need for warmth and rest. He worked methodically, piling the brush just inside the cave entrance. Then, from another compartment on his belt, he produced a small ignition device. A controlled spark, and a tiny flame sprang to life, quickly catching on the tinder-dry material. The fire crackled, casting flickering orange light onto the cave walls, chasing away some of the oppressive gloom and the encroaching chill. He stepped back, again gesturing for her to enter. Lyra hesitated for only a moment. The allure of the fire, the promise of shelter from the wind, was too strong. She limped into the small cave, settling herself near the growing blaze, stretching her hands towards its warmth. It felt like a miracle. The The hunter remained outside, a sentinel at the cave mouth, his back to her, facing out into the darkness. He was a shield between her and the night, or so it seemed. Why was he doing this? Protecting her? Keeping her alive for some other purpose? The question circled endlessly in her mind. Exhaustion, momentarily held at bay by adrenaline and fear, began to reclaim her. Her eyelids grew heavy. She fought against it, terrified of closing her eyes, of being vulnerable. But the warmth of the fire, the relative safety of the cave, and the strange, silent guardianship of the hunter conspired against her resolve. Her head drooped, and she drifted into an uneasy sleep, the image of the shadowed figure at the cave entrance imprinted on her mind. When she awoke, it was to the grey light of pre-dawn. The fire had died down to glowing embers. Her ankle still throbbed, but the acute pain was gone. She sat up, disoriented, then remembered. The hunter. She looked towards the cave entrance. He was gone. Panic seized her for a moment. Had he abandoned her? Or was this the true trap? Then she saw it, a small parcel wrapped in a piece of dark cloth, placed neatly near where she had slept. Beside it lay her own empty canteen, now full. Lyra cautiously unwrapped the parcel. Inside were several dense, nutrient-rich ration bars, standard hunter issue, she guessed, far superior to the stale crust she'd been surviving on. Her stomach rumbled in anticipation. He had left her food and water. And he had repaired her broken strap on her satchel, the one that held her meager belongings, with a neat, almost invisible stitch of some metallic thread. This went far beyond simple pragmatism. These were acts of consideration. She ate one of the ration bars slowly, savoring its bland but filling texture. The water was again cool and clean. As she ate, her mind wrestled with the enigma of her silent protector. Hunters were instruments of the council, extensions of their will. They were conditioned, stripped of emotion, or so the stories went. Yet this one was different. After she finished eating, she repacked her satchel, her gaze repeatedly drifting to the cave entrance. Would he return? Was he watching her even now? She decided she couldn't wait. She had a mission, and he had, for whatever inexplicable reason, given her a reprieve, a chance to continue. She stepped out of the cave, her bandaged ankle feeling much stronger. The crimson waste looked less menacing in the growing light. She looked for any sign of him, a footprint, a disturbance in the dust, but there was nothing. He moved like a phantom. She chose a direction, a path that seemed to lead towards the rumored location of a hidden rebel outpost, the only place she could think of that might be able to help her with the locket. She had been walking for perhaps an hour, the landscape gradually shifting from barren rock to sparse, hardy vegetation, when a glint of metal caught her eye. He was there, perched on a high rock formation to her left, observing her. He wasn't following closely, but he was accompanying her. A silent, watchful guardian. When she met his gaze, or where she assumed his gaze was, he made no move. He simply continued his vigil. A strange sort of comfort settled over Lyra. She wasn't alone. But the why still loomed large, a persistent, unanswered question that pricked at the edges of her gratitude. Days bled into one another, marked by the slow passage of Xylos's twin suns across the amber sky. The routine was unvarying. Lyra would walk, and the hunter, Kale, she had started calling him that in her mind, needing a name for the silent presence that now defined her journey, would shadow her. He kept his distance, usually a few hundred meters, sometimes disappearing from sight for hours only to reappear on a distant ridge or in the mouth of a canyon she was about to enter. He never spoke. Each morning, she would find a small supply of rations and a refilled canteen left near her makeshift camp. He never approached her directly while she was awake, unless it was to silently point out a safer path or warn her away from unseen dangers, a patch of unstable ground, the lair of some desert predator, with a subtle gesture. Lyra began to adapt to his presence, the initial fear replaced by a cautious curiosity, and then, reluctantly, by a fragile sense of security. She found herself looking for him, a small knot of anxiety tightening in her chest if he was out of sight for too long. she started leaving a portion of her own meager supplies for him in return, a piece of dried fruit she'd scavenged, or a strip of cured meat, though she never saw him take it. It was a silent conversation, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of fear and conditioning. One evening, as a dust storm gathered on the horizon, whipping the crimson sand into stinging clouds, Cale appeared closer than usual. He led her to a series of ancient, crumbling ruins, half buried in the sand, offering better shelter than her usual rock overhangs. As she huddled inside a relatively intact structure, Cale took up his customary position near the entrance, a bulwark against the howling wind and stinging sand. The storm raged for hours, the sound a deafening roar. Lyra watched him, the flickering light of her small glow rod illuminating his still form. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible above the storm. He didn't turn, didn't react. "The council wants me dead. Or they want the locket." She touched the data locket through her tunic. "You're a hunter. This is not your function." Silence. The wind shrieked, rattling the loose stones of the ruin. Lyra sighed, frustrated but not surprised. She had tried before, many times, to elicit a response, a word, anything. Always, she was met with that implacable silence. "What do they even call you?" she pressed on, a sudden weariness in her tone. "Do you have a name? Or are you just a number, a designation?" Still nothing. But then, a fractional movement. His head tilted, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't an answer, but it was something. A flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps? Or maybe just her own desperate imagination. The storm began to subside as dawn approached, leaving behind a world scoured clean, the air fresh and cool. Lyra emerged from the ruin, stiff and tired. Cale was already alert, scanning the horizon. He turned, and for the first time, he held her gaze for more than a fleeting moment. Beneath the hood, she still couldn't make out his features clearly, but there was an intensity there, a focused regard that made her breath catch. He then did something entirely unexpected. He reached up and slowly, deliberately, pushed back his hood. Lyra gasped softly. His face, when revealed, was not the monstrous or cybernetically augmented visage she might have half expected. It was a human face, undeniably. Younger than she'd thought, perhaps only a few years older than her own 22 cycles. His features were sharp, angular, framed by dark hair cropped close to his skull. Scars traced patterns across his cheekbones and jaw, old wounds that spoke of a harsh life. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a startling ice blue, intelligent and weary, holding a depth of experience that belied his years. They were eyes that had seen too much. He still didn't speak, but the act of revealing his face felt monumental, a crack in the armor, both literal and metaphorical. It was a gesture of trust, or perhaps a test. Lyra found her voice, though it trembled slightly. "Cale," she said, testing the name she had given him aloud. His expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered, a subtle acknowledgement. So, he had heard her. Perhaps he had heard all her one-sided conversations. He gave a curt nod, then his gaze shifted past her, towards the distant, hazy mountains that marked the edge of the Crimson Waste. His objective, it seemed, lay in that direction, and by extension, so did hers. The unspoken question hung in the air, would she continue to follow? Could she trust this man who was bred to be her enemy, yet had shown her nothing but inexplicable kindness? He had saved her life multiple times now, provided for her, and now, he had shown her his face. It was more connection than she'd had with anyone since fleeing her captured home. She thought of the locket again. Its secrets were too important. She had to take the risk. The Blackwood Range, she stated, more than asked. There are old mining tunnels there. Some say the Resistance uses them. Cale's icy eyes met hers again. He gave another almost imperceptible nod. He knew. Of course, he knew. Was he leading her to them? Or was he using her to find them? The ambiguity remained, a persistent shadow. But now, it was a shadow with a face, with eyes that held a hint of something other than cold duty. He turned and began to walk, his pace steady. Lyra hesitated only a moment before following. The dynamic had shifted. He was no longer just the hunter, he was Cale. And she, it seemed, was no longer just his quarry. Their journey together had taken on a new, uncertain dimension, fraught with unspoken understanding and lingering danger. The path to the Blackwood Range was more treacherous, the terrain rising steeply, the air thinning. Cale's knowledge of the land was encyclopedic. He navigated them through forgotten goat tracks and crumbling switchbacks, avoiding patrols of council enforcers that Lyra wouldn't have spotted until it was too late. He moved with an almost preternatural awareness, his senses honed to a razor's edge. One evening, camped in a narrow ravine, a chilling sound echoed through the mountains, the guttural howl of a Xylan shadowcat, a predator known for its stealth and ferocity. Lyra's blood ran cold. She had heard stories of entire scouting parties vanishing, leaving only shreds of clothing behind. Cale was instantly alert, his hand resting on the hilt of a vibro knife she hadn't noticed he carried. He scanned the darkness, his head moving in short, sharp arcs. "Stay by the fire," he said, his voice a low rasp, the first words he had spoken directly to her beyond a simple directive. It was startling, deeper than she'd imagined. Before Lyra could respond, a hulking shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness at the ravine's edge. Two malevolent green eyes gleamed. The shadowcat was enormous, easily twice the size of a terrestrial tiger, its fur the color of charcoal, blending perfectly with the night. It snarled, a sound like rocks grinding together, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Cale moved with blinding speed. He didn't draw his knife. Instead, he pushed Lyra behind him, positioning himself between her and the beast, and let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in the very air. It was not human. It was primal, challenging, a sound that spoke the shadowcat's own brutal language. The massive predator hesitated, its ears flattening. It took a step back, then another, its green eyes fixed on Cale. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, Cale utterly still, the embodiment of unwavering defiance. Then, with a final, frustrated snarl, the shadowcat turned and melted back into the darkness. Lyra was trembling, her heart pounding. Cale slowly relaxed his stance, though his gaze remained fixed on the spot where the creature had vanished. "It won't return tonight," he said, his voice returning to its more human register, though still quiet. "They respect strength." Lyra stared at his back, astounded. "How did you?" "Hunters learn many languages," he replied, a cryptic answer that only deepened the mystery surrounding him. He turned, and his ice-blue eyes met hers. There was no triumph in them, only a lingering watchfulness. "You should rest." The next day, as they climbed higher into the Blackwood Range, the air grew thin and biting. Lyra, though fitter now than when she'd started her flight, struggled with the altitude. Cale, seemingly immune, occasionally paused, offering her his canteen or a moment to catch her breath without comment. It was during one such pause, as they rested on a narrow ledge overlooking a vast, forested valley, that Cale finally spoke again, unprompted. "The locket you carry," he said, his voice soft, almost carried away by the wind. "It contains coordinates, doesn't it?" And Maud. Lyra tensed, her hand instinctively going to the locket beneath her tunic. "How do you know?" He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the distant valley. "The Council fears information more than weapons. They believe knowledge is the most dangerous contagion." He paused, then continued, "My original directive was to retrieve it. And you, and me." Lyra pressed. "Alive or dead?" A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. The preference was alive. "You have a particular genetic marker they are interested in." A resistance to the Xylan psych plague that decimated the outer colonies. Lyra was stunned. She knew her family line had been remarkably untouched by the plague generations ago, but she never imagined it was something the Council tracked or valued. "So, you weren't sent to kill me initially. My orders were to secure you and the asset. Elimination was a secondary protocol. If retrieval proved complicated." He finally turned to look at her, his expression serious. "But orders can be re-evaluated. Situations can change. Why did they change for you?" Lyra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cale looked away again, towards the jagged peaks. I've followed many orders, Lyra. Taken many lives. For a long time, I believed it was necessary. For order. For what the council called the greater good. His voice was laced with a weariness that seemed to age him beyond his years. But the greater good always seemed to benefit the council exclusively. The waste is filled with the ghosts of those who disagreed. He took a slow breath. When I found you, you were not what I expected. Not a subversive. Not a hardened criminal. Just someone fighting to survive. Someone protecting something she believed in. He looked back at her, his ice blue eyes holding hers. And the locket. I scanned its outer casing when I tended your ankle. The encryption is old, pre-council. From the freeholds of Eldoria. My mother was from Eldoria. The revelation hung in the thin mountain air. His mother. A hunter, a product of the council's brutal conditioning, speaking of his mother with a hint of something. Sadness? Connection? It humanized him further, chipping away at the last vestiges of the terrifying, faceless automaton Lyra had first perceived. What does the locket contain? She asked, her voice soft. If you scanned it? Only surface data. The core is heavily shielded. But the Eldorian signature, it speaks of hope, of a way to fight their control, to expose their lies. He looked down at his gloved hands. I was a child when the council took me. They train us from youth. They strip away your name, your past. They tell you emotion is weakness, obedience is strength. He clenched his fists. For a long time, I believed them. It was easier than remembering. Lyra felt a pang of sympathy, an emotion she would never have thought possible to feel for a hunter. He was a victim too, in his own way, twisted and molded by the same oppressive regime she was fleeing. So, you're not taking me to the council? She asked, needing to hear it. Cale met her gaze, his expression resolute. No. I am taking you to people who can use what that locket holds. People who still fight. He gestured towards a narrow, almost invisible trail leading down into the forested valley. The resistance. They are not legend. They are real. And they are expecting us. Lyra was bewildered. How? I sent a signal 2 days ago, Cale said calmly. When I was certain of what? That you were worth the risk, he stated, his ice blue eyes unwavering. And that I was ready to choose a different path. The admission was profound. He was defecting. He was betraying the council, everything he had been trained to be, for her, for the hope contained in a small data locket. The hunter was not just doing the opposite of killing her, he was joining her fight. The weight of his decision, the immense danger he was now placing himself in, settled upon Lyra. Her own fear was now tinged with a fierce determination to ensure his sacrifice was not in vain. Their journey had reached its true turning point. They were no longer hunter and hunted, but allies against a common, powerful enemy. The descent into the valley was perilous, the trail steep and often obscured by dense undergrowth. Cale moved with his usual quiet competence, but Lyra noticed a new tension in him, a heightened alertness that spoke of the dangers they were now actively courting. He was no longer just a rogue element, he was a traitor, and the council would show no mercy if they were caught. They reached the valley floor as dusk began to settle, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Cale led her to a massive, ancient tree whose roots formed a hollow large enough to offer shelter. We wait here, he said, his voice low. They will make contact. Lyra nodded, her heart pounding. The silence of the forest was different from the silence of the waste, alive, filled with the rustle of unseen creatures, the sigh of the wind through the high branches. She found herself trusting Cale implicitly now. His actions, his confession, had forged a bond stronger than any words. Hours passed. Lyra dozed fitfully, waking with a start at every snap of a twig. Cale remained awake, a motionless sentinel, his gaze sweeping the perimeter. Just as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, a soft bird call echoed through the trees, too precise, too patterned to be natural. Cale responded with a similar call. Moments later, figures emerged from the shadows, moving with the same silent grace as Cale. They were armed, their faces grim but resolute. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, their clothing practical, blending with the forest. The woman, who appeared to be the leader, stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Cale. "Designate 734, she said, her voice firm, though not unkind. "You are a long way from your usual hunting grounds." Cale inclined his head. "My designation is no longer relevant, Commander Vasher." "I am Cale." Vasher's eyebrows rose slightly. "Cale," she repeated. Her gaze shifted to Lyra. "And this is the girl with the Eldorian legacy." Lyra stepped forward, clutching the locket. "I am Lyra. And yes, I have something I believe you need." Vasher studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "We've been expecting you." Cale's message was unexpected, but welcome. Few of his kind ever see the truth. She looked back at Cale. "You know the price of this choice." "There's no going back, I am aware," Cale said, his voice steady. "The Council will hunt you relentlessly. More relentlessly than they hunted her." "Let them come," Cale replied, a dangerous glint in his ice-blue eyes. "This time, I'm not hunting for them." A new chapter had begun. The solitary flight had become a shared stand. Lyra looked at Cale, no longer seeing the terrifying hunter, but a man who had defied his creators, who had chosen conscience over conditioning, hope over despair. He had been sent to destroy her future, but instead, he had given her one, and in doing so, had perhaps found his own. The Crimson Waste lay far behind them, but the path ahead, into the heart of the Resistance and against the full might of the Unseen Council, would be fraught with even greater perils. Yet, Lyra felt a surge of hope she hadn't dared to feel in a very long time. She was not alone. And the hunter, her unlikely savior, now stood beside her, ready to face whatever came next.